Dion Mattis.
And I guess as we share the time with you, Patrice, it is 5:30 and a genuine home run today.
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is. Are making it home run after the shutdown weekend. At this time, we'd like to let you know that it is our season finale of The Legal Landscape. And joining us today, Courtney Bailey, managing partner at Duncox, will discuss the topic Data Protection Standards, Learning Your Rights to Privacy. Now, data has become increasingly valuable, sensitive, and a protected resource in the digital world of the information age. And it has in fact been described as the new oil in the 21st century. Did you know that? Yep. Well, the importance of data will likely increase exponentially in a post-COVID world. And given the acceleration in online commerce in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, it's the way everyone's looking to go, eh? So in keeping with this international movement towards the protection of data, in 2020, the Jamaica Parliament passed the Data Protection Act. And the Act seeks to protect an individual's personal data by, amongst other things, creating several data protection standards to govern the handling of personal data. Understanding these standards will enable us to know what rights we have. Do you know what rights you have in relation to the personal data that you have out there and how companies use that data? So, listeners, you can send your questions to our WhatsApp line at 876-383-1166. And are we taking calls today as well, Pat? You may call us live to studio 876-906-9559 as we welcome to our legal landscape, Courtney Bailey, managing partner at Duncox. Good afternoon to you, sir. Welcome to The Edge.
Good afternoon, Dion, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. We are going to go right into the Data Protection Act. It was passed in 2020, and ask you, is it presently in effect?
Well, Dion, since the Act was passed by Parliament in 2020, it's now a part of the body of laws for Jamaica. However, this particular law will not come into effect until the relevant minister, who is the Minister of Science, Energy and Technology, publishes a notice in the Gazette stating the specific date on which the Act is to come into operation. Well, the minister has not yet published that notice, and the government first needs to establish the Office of the Information Commissioner, which will play a key regulatory function in the operation of the Act before the Act comes into effect. So the short answer to your question, it is on the books, but not yet in effect.
So do we have any idea when it is likely to come into effect?
Well, I cannot give you a precise date. However, in July of this year, the House of Representatives approved the salary and contractual terms of the Information Commissioner, and the Minister advised the House that steps have been taken to determine the salary and employment terms of other officers and staff of the Office of the Information Commissioner, as well as to begin drafting the regulations, notices, and orders under the Act. So whereas we don't yet have a specific date, it is clear that the government is steadily putting in place what will be required for the Act to come into effect. So I would say sooner rather than later, and it's not a question of if, but when.
We're speaking with managing partner at Duncox, Courtney Bailey. And remember, you can also WhatsApp us your questions about the Data Protection Act and your data protection, your privacy to the protection. Let me start again. Data Protection Standards, Learning Your Rights to Privacy. Let me make sure I say it as the topic is for the day. So you can send in your questions to our WhatsApp line, 876-383-1166, or call us in the studio if you're listening now to Courtney Bailey and you want to ask a question. The line is open to you, my listeners. So we need to ask you then, since we don't yet have a specific date when this act will come into effect, should we begin preparing for it?
Well, The Act provides a 2-year transitional period from the date it comes into effect, which will allow persons or organizations that handle personal data to fully comply with its various provisions. So once the Act comes into operation, you will have 2 years to ensure full compliance. However, it is possible that proceedings may be brought against persons or organizations that handle personal data, even during the transitional period, if they act in a way that cannot be described as in good faith. In any event, since the Act represents what I would call a seismic shift in how we think about our rights to personal data, and it will take some time to put systems in place to comply with it, I would suggest that we begin from now to familiarize ourselves with it.
Most persons are likely, Courtney, to be intimidated at the prospect of trying to understand, as you say, a legal statute like this. So how would you suggest that persons who are interested in learning about their rights or obligations under the Act to go about doing so?
Yeah, well, you're quite correct to say that the Act can be intimidating for non-legally trained persons. Where I would suggest people start is with the 8 data protection standards. You see, the Act is centered around 8 data protection standards which must be met in handling personal data by persons or organizations who determine the purposes for which and the way in which personal data are processed. The Act calls those persons data controllers. Now, whereas the data protection standards impose obligations on these data controllers, these same standards at the same time represent rights for the individuals whose data is being handled by the data controllers. And the persons whose data is being processed are called in the Act data subjects. So I would suggest that both the data controllers as well as the data subjects begin by familiarizing themselves with these 8 data protection standards as a means of understanding both the obligations of the data controllers as well as the rights of the data subjects, which is the man in the street whose data is being handled.
You've used the term data protection standards several times. Can you tell us what are these 8 data protection standards you're speaking of?
Yes, I would be happy to. So there are 8 data protection standards. The first one is that personal data must be processed fairly and lawfully. And that essentially means that the consent of the data subject must first be obtained and that there must be a legitimate basis to process that person's data. The second standard is that personal data is only to be obtained for specified purposes and not to be processed for any other purposes. If an organization gets your data to do X, they can't use it and turn around and use it for direct marketing or other purposes like that. The third standard is that personal data is to be adequate, relevant, and not excessive in relation to the purpose for which it is to be processed. And that essentially means that it seeks to prevent data controllers from obtaining more information than is necessary for the intended purpose for which data was given. The fourth standard is that personal data must be accurate and, where necessary, kept up to date. The fifth, that personal data must not be kept for longer than is necessary to satisfy the intended processing purposes, and it must be disposed of in accordance with the Act's regulation. The sixth standard is that personal data must be processed in accordance with the rights of data subjects under the legislation. The seventh, that personal data is to be protected by taking the appropriate technical and organizational measures and by prompt notification of security breaches to the Information Commissioner. In other words, your data must be protected, and if there's a breach, you must be alerted of it by means of notification to the Information Commissioner. And then finally, the eighth standard is that personal data must not be transferred outside Jamaica to another country without the adequate levels of data protection being in place for Jamaican data subjects.
You know, you've mentioned the personal data. You keep referring to personal data. Can you explain to everyone as well, what is that?
Yes, that's a very important term in the Act. In fact, it is a defined term, and it refers to information relating to a living individual or an individual who has been dead for less than 30 years, who can be identified from the information alone or from the information plus other information in the possession of the data controller. In other words, either somebody's alive or maybe someone who has been dead for less than 30 years. And that person can be identified from either the information that the data controller has, or maybe if they have another piece of information that would be able to identify the person. This is the kind of information that the Act seeks to regulate how it is handled by data controllers. And the Act also imposes higher standards for the handling of what it calls sensitive personal data, which is a subgroup of personal data. And that sensitive personal data is information relating to the data subject's genetic or biometric data, racial or ethnic origin, political or religious beliefs, physical or mental health or condition, sex life, trade union membership, and the alleged commission of any offense. And you can see quite clearly why those would be described as sensitive personal data.
Okay, thanks for explaining that. So we now understand what personal data is and what data protection standards are imposed on data controllers for handling this kind of data. So how can this understanding help the average man on the street know what his rights are in relation to his personal data?
Yeah. Well, I think that knowing what standards data controllers will be held to in handling your personal data gives you an understanding of what your rights are in relation to that data. So, for instance, the first data protection standard means that, generally speaking, no one can process your personal data without first having your consent and without having a legitimate basis for doing so. The second standard would mean that your bank can't obtain your information for the purposes of opening a bank account and then turn around and also use that information for marketing purposes without your consent.
Without consent, okay.
Yeah. The fourth standard would mean that if you're completing a questionnaire, you can only be required to supply what information is necessary for the purpose of the business you're conducting. So if you're buying a car and someone is asking you what is your political affiliation, then you would realize that you have no reason to answer that question, and they would be in breach of a data protection standard to seek to get more information than they need. The fifth standard would mean that a data controller isn't entitled to hold your information indefinitely, but must dispose of it properly after it is no longer needed. And the seventh standard would mean that persons or organizations holding your data must secure it properly and promptly report breaches. And the eighth standard would mean that your data cannot be transferred outside of Jamaica without similar levels of protection or without your consent. So I'm giving these examples to make the point that understanding what the data protection standards are is a good first step to knowing what rights you have in relation to your own personal data.
Well, all I can say to you, Courtney, is it's back to school for students. It's also back to school for parents and everyone using anything at all or giving their personal data anywhere. It's so important for us to realize what the Data Protection Act is, the standards, and learning our rights to privacy. Want to thank you so very much for joining us. Do you have any quick hashtag did you know for us before you go?
Well, I have one. Did you know that in 2011, the Jamaican Constitution was amended to include a right to the protection of privacy and communication amongst the fundamental rights enshrined in the Constitution? So each of us has a fundamental right to protecting the privacy of our personal information, which is a right that the Data Protection Act seeks to protect.
Well, now we do. And we'll see you next season, hopefully. This has been season 2, and we have really learned a lot. We've enjoyed the journey with you, the legal landscape here on The Edge. Thank you so much for all the information today. Courtney Bailey, Managing Partner at Dunn Cox, Data Protection Standard, learning your rights to privacy. It's been a pleasure having you for the topic today, sir.
Thank you, Dion, and it's been a pleasure doing this program with you, and we look forward to the next season.
we look forward to having you soon too. Take care now.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.